The ad rate on The Flip Wilson Show peaked at $86,000 a minute. That's what NBC could charge in 1972 to put a 30-second commercial inside a variety hour, hosted by a man who'd been sleeping in foster homes 25 years earlier, a man who'd lied about his age to get into the Air Force at 16 because it was better than where he was. By that point, his show was the second most watched program in the entire country, beaten only by All in the Family. Time magazine put his face on the cover in January of that year and called him television's first black superstar. 4 years later, the show was gone, and so, in most ways that mattered to the public, was he. What happened in between, and especially what happened right at the hinge point where the show ended, is the part nobody has ever fully agreed on. Some accounts say NBC canceled it because ratings had slipped and Wilson kept asking for more money than the network wanted to pay. Other accounts, including ones from people who worked with him, say Wilson walked away on his own, rather than watch the show get smaller and cheaper around him. Both things may be partly true. The record itself is messy on this point, and it's worth sitting with that messiness instead of pretending there's a clean answer, because what he did next only makes sense once you accept that even the people closest to him weren't sure why he really left. Clairo Wilson Jr. was born on December 8, 1933 in Jersey City, New Jersey, one of 10 children. His mother left when he was 7, and after that, he and several of his siblings moved between foster homes and, for stretches, reform school. He ran away from most of the placements. By his own account, he was hungry a lot, and he stole a little to eat. None of that had a name yet that pointed toward comedy. There was no coffee cup on a table, no obvious sign that this particular 7-year-old would end up on a magazine cover. At 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Air Force. He served from 1950 to 1954, and it was there, doing routine work and needling the men around him during downtime, that he got the nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. Fellow servicemen thought he was flipped out and shortened it to Flip. He kept the name when he got out. He also discovered, in the Air Force, that he was good at organizing paperwork and even better at making a room of tired, bored men laugh, and that the second skill was more interesting to him than the first. After his discharge, he worked as a bellhop at the Manor Plaza Hotel in San Francisco, and he entertained guests there on the side, testing material on whoever would listen. Then he did what a lot of comics with no money did in the 1950s. He went on the road playing clubs on what was known at the time as the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues that booked black performers for black audiences, mostly in the South and industrial North. It was not glamorous work. Pay was inconsistent, travel was long, and audiences could be rough on a comic who didn't land. Wilson did this for years. He also became a regular at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, one of the few venues where a black comedian could build a real following and be taken seriously by other performers. He got his break, more or less by accident, in 1965. Red Fox was a guest on The Tonight Show, and Johnny Carson asked him who the funniest comedian working right now was. Fox said, "Flip Wilson." Carson booked him. Wilson's first appearance went well enough that Carson kept inviting him back, and he also started turning up on The Ed Sullivan Show, which Wilson later said had done more for his career than almost anything else. Around the same time, he was recording comedy albums, including Cowboys and Colored People in 1967, which is generally credited with getting Hollywood's attention. By 1969, NBC had given him his own primetime special, and it did well enough that the network offered him something bigger. An hour-long weekly variety show, all his. The Flip Wilson Show debuted on September 17, 1970. It used a theater-in-the-round set, audience seated on all sides, no fixed backdrop the way most variety shows had. It was a technical choice as much as an aesthetic one, and it gave the show a different rhythm than its competitors. Two characters carried most of the weight. Reverend Leroy ran the fictional church of What's Happening Now. a minister whose parishioners were never quite sure if he was a con man, and probably right not to be sure. The bigger one was Geraldine Jones, a sharp, self-possessed woman with an unseen boyfriend named Killer, who Wilson played in full costume. No drag-for-laughs mugging, no wink to the camera that this was a man playing a woman. Geraldine talked back to men, refused to be embarrassed by anything, and became, for a lot of viewers, the reason they tuned in. "The devil made me buy this dress" turned into a national catchphrase. So did "what you see is what you get," which years later gave computer engineers at Xerox PARC the acronym WYSIWYG when they needed a name for displays that showed documents exactly as they'd print. The guest list over 4 seasons reads like a cross-section of Black American entertainment at the time. Lena Horne, Harry Belafonte, Aretha Franklin, The Supremes, the Jackson 5, in one of their earliest national television appearances, The Temptations, Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell. Wilson greeted every one of them with what became known as the Flip Wilson handshake, a specific sequence of hand slaps, elbow bumps, and hip bumps that he'd run through with each guest at the top of the show. George Carlin wrote for the program and appeared on it regularly, doing a news weather sports satire bit that he and Wilson developed together. The show won 2 Emmy Awards from 11 nominations across its run and earned Wilson a Golden Globe for Best Actor in a television series in 1971, with 2 more nominations after that. Wilson also won a Grammy for his 1970 comedy album, The Devil Made Me Buy This Dress. He was, for 2 seasons, being paid more than $1 million a year, an extraordinary figure for the period, and one that put him among the highest-paid entertainers in the country regardless of race. Then the numbers started moving the other way. Ratings across the entire variety show genre began sliding in the early to mid-1970s, a trend that hit nearly every show of that format, not just Wilson's. At the same time, Wilson kept asking NBC for more money, repeatedly, and the requests were large enough that they strained the show's budget on their own. Some reporting from the period frames this as the direct cause of cancellation. The show got too expensive relative to what it was earning. Other sources say Wilson made the decision himself, tired of running a production that had gotten large and cumbersome, and unwilling to watch it get cut down piece by piece to save money. NBC's own later record, and several biographical accounts written since, don't resolve the disagreement. The final episode aired on June 27, 1974. Whichever version is closer to true, what happened to Wilson afterward looked the same either way. He did not immediately try to replace what he'd lost. He appeared in a few films, including Uptown Saturday Night in 1974 alongside Sidney Poitier, Bill Cosby, and Richard Pryor. He voiced the fox in a 1976 television musical adaptation of Pinocchio. He hosted a 1-hour NBC special that same year built around Olympic gymnast Nadia Comaneci. These were guest slots and side projects, not a second act. By most accounts from people who knew him, he had gotten exactly what he wanted out of show business with the variety show, and there wasn't an obvious next thing he was chasing. What he did chase, according to people close to him and later reporting, was a fairly unstructured private life. Road trips with no particular destination, motorcycles, and drugs, principally marijuana and cocaine, which he'd used on and off since his Air Force years, and which he now had the time and money to indulge without much interference. In 1979, a woman who said she had lived with him for 4 years sued him for $1 million property settlement. It was described at the time as the second legal dispute he'd been involved in over a 2-year period. The third came in March 1981. Wilson had just returned from a goodwill trip to Nagoya, Japan, where he was supposed to deliver a letter from Nagoya's mayor to Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley as part of a sister city ceremony. He never made it to the ceremony. At Los Angeles International Airport, acting on an anonymous tip, Police stopped him as he was heading to his car with his wife and his nephew. He agreed to a body search. Officers found 2.5 grams of cocaine, a quantity of hashish oil, and a small amount of marijuana, with a combined street value estimated around $1,000. He was booked, released on $2,500 bail, and charged with possession. He also lost a recurring endorsement deal with 7-Up over the arrest. The case dragged on for 3 years. In 1984, the California Supreme Court threw out the charges, ruling that the airport search had been illegal and that Wilson had been unlawfully detained before officers ever searched his luggage. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to review that decision, which ended the matter for good. Wilson was never convicted of anything from that arrest. But the story that had circulated in the meantime of a former television superstar caught with drugs at the airport had already done whatever damage it was going to do to how the public thought of him, regardless of how the legal question was eventually settled. He kept working in smaller ways through the 1980s. In December 1983, he hosted Saturday Night Live, opening with a Geraldine sketch, and Eddie Murphy later spoke about how much he'd taken from watching Wilson work that night. In 1984, he hosted a short-lived revival of the game show People Are Funny. In 1985, he starred in Charlie and Cuomo, a CBS sitcom co-starring Gladys Knight that was built, fairly transparently, as an answer to The Cosby Show. It lasted 1 season. Wilson reportedly wasn't especially invested in it. Several people who worked with him said he had never actually wanted to be an actor in the conventional sense, and that the sitcom format didn't suit how he thought about performing. In 1993, on St. Patrick's Day, his son David was riding a motorcycle, one that Wilson himself had bought him, on an access road behind a hotel in Palm Desert. He crashed and was found unconscious. The accident left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. David had been a competitive golfer before the crash, close to his father in some ways and at odds with him in others, including a disagreement over golf that had been simmering between them before the accident happened. He remained quadriplegic for the rest of his life, and, in interviews decades later, he described teaching himself to play golf in his head, lying in a hospital bed with nothing else to do, as a way of getting through it. Wilson made a handful of further television appearances in the 1990s, a cameo on Living Single in 1993, another on The Drew Carey Show in 1996. In 1997, he went on The Howard Stern Show, and in the kind of unguarded moment that had defined a lot of his public persona going back to Geraldine, told Stern he'd had a penile implant, then demonstrated the device on air. It was the sort of story that got repeated more than almost anything else from his later years, more than the arrest, more than the lawsuit, because it was the version of Flip Wilson people still recognized. Unbothered, blunt, willing to say the thing other people wouldn't. His last television appearance was a guest spot on The Drew Carey Show, playing himself, which aired about a week before he died. On November 25th, 1998, Wilson died in Malibu, California, from metastatic liver cancer. He was 64. He was cremated at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park and Mortuary, and his ashes were scattered off Malibu Beach. He was inducted into the New Jersey Hall of Fame in 2019, more than 2 decades after his death, in the arts and entertainment category, for a body of work that had by then mostly survived as reruns and old clips rather than as an active presence in American television. The Flip Wilson Show itself had a strange afterlife of its own. Half-hour edited versions ran on TV Land from 1997 to 2006, and the full episodes turned up again on TV One a few years after that, introducing Geraldine and Reverend Leroy to viewers who'd never seen the original broadcasts and had no memory of the ad rates or the ratings war or any of it. What's left of the specific question, whether he quit or was pushed, is mostly in the accounts of people who were there, and they don't line up cleanly. NBC's business pressure was real. The budget had grown past what the ratings could support, and the network wanted him to take less money at exactly the moment his fame told him he should be asking for more. Wilson's own account, in the handful of interviews where he addressed it directly, tended to describe walking away as something closer to his own decision, made before the network could make it for him. It's possible both things were happening at once, that the walking away and the being pushed arrived at the same door from opposite directions, and that by 1974, neither side particularly needed to force the other's hand. The show ended. What's certain is what came after. 4 years at the absolute center of American television, and then a quarter century where a man who'd once commanded $86,000 a minute in ad time chose, by whatever mix of his own will and the industry's, to mostly disappear from the medium that had made him famous and never really tried to come back.